Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome Shwetha Surender. She is the Director New Mobility at Frost & Sullivan, and she will give us more insight about the situation of autonomous mobility and transportation and its outlook.
Good morning. In today's presentation, we'll look at the evolution of the autonomous mobility market and try to understand the impact to corporate mobility. So we'll start by looking at what the definition of the market is, look at the ecosystem around it, new business models that are evolving, what's going on at the city level, and then draw reference to how it could potentially impact corporate mobility. Now, this slide gives a high-level view of the standard definitions that we see of automation. Now, at L0, there's no autonomy. In L1, you start to see some basic driver assistance systems, but they're included in the base vehicle design and the driver is completely in control of the vehicle. In L2, you have slightly more advanced automated features like adaptive cruise control with lane change assist, but the driver is required to be engaged at all times. In L3, the vehicle is automated. You have features like automated lane keeping systems, high-speed driving. The driver is engaged for the most part. However, at some points of time, he does hand over control to the vehicle itself. In L4, the vehicle is highly automated and is capable of handling all driving tasks under a premeditated set of conditions. The driver can take back control of the vehicle whenever he chooses to. And in L5, the vehicle is completely automated. It can handle all driving tasks under all conditions. The driver may not have access to the vehicle at all. Now that we've established what we mean really by autonomous driving, let's move on to the evolution that we're seeing in the business model. So here we're talking about the shift that we're seeing away from vehicle ownership towards usership. Now, in the past, 3 to 5 years ago, vehicles were very, very clearly designed as a product to be owned. OEMs sold vehicles and earned revenue from services and spare parts. Now, with connectivity and greater digitization of the cars, you are seeing a slight shift towards services within the vehicle itself, servitization of the vehicle. But as it stands today, ownership models are still product-centric. Now, what we are expected to see is that as the market evolves, we'll start moving towards a vehicle as a service model of car ownership. And this means that connectivity and ADAS features will be available on demand, pay-as-you-go. And from there, we'll effectively move to the mobility as a service model, where we'd start seeing the shift from ownership to usership, where FOD vehicles are not owned anymore, but rather offered as mobility services in the form of getting access to vehicles through car sharing, through ride hailing, and demand responsive transit. Now, the ecosystem is expanding quite rapidly, and you have a wide range of stakeholders here, from OEMs, technology providers, fleet owners, mobility service providers, and cities and governments. The next slide gives a snapshot of how we are indeed seeing this value chain evolve. Now, you see that the value chain is segmented into different layers. In the semiconductor layer, you have certain base hardware that is developed that feeds into the perception layer. The perception layer comprises of enablers, which is technologies like sensors, processors, ML and AI platforms, HD maps and localization, technologies that really make the vehicle autonomous and allow the vehicle to read, understand, and analyze the environment and function independently. The aggregation layer is the final layer, and this is where we will see autonomous mobility services being offered to the consumers. These could be private individuals or governments or corporates. Now, the ecosystem is quite wide and can include OEMs, new mobility service providers, or an emerging group of new age companies like Apple and Sony. In the next slide, what you see is the new revenue sources that are evolving in regard to this market. Now, at Frost, we estimate that there are 12 new revenue streams, and these are broadly categorized into mobility services, vehicle services, logistics services, and other peripheral services. Vehicle services include on-demand feature updates, parking services, where you see the whole aspect of building, owning, operating platforms. Now, logistics includes deliveries, and this could range from last mile to long-haul freight. It also includes services like curbside and services offered to refuse and recovery as well. Peripheral services include value-added vehicle services such as usage-based insurance products, vehicle data service, and maintenance services. Our focus for today is really going to be mobility services. Now, autonomous mobility services typically include robotaxis, autonomous shuttles, monopods, and even autonomous buses. Now, over the next few slides, we'll look at the ecosystem, we'll understand the business models, key players, the regulatory outlook, and the city involvement, as well as the impact on the overall transport system. Our expectation is that the autonomous mobility service market is extremely nascent today. However, it is expected to grow to about 13 billion by 2030. Now, on the next slide, what you see is an overview of how the autonomous shared passenger mobility market is really structured. At Frost & Sullivan, our view is that it is composed of three operator segments. The first is the autonomous vehicle manufacturers, and these are companies that are designing vehicles for shared mobility services. For instance, Toyota has modified its Ioniq to cater to an autonomous ride-hailing model. Silks is another company that's developed a special box-shaped robotaxi that's bidirectional as well and dramatically improves efficiencies. Now, the second category is that of autonomous technology providers. They enable autonomous operations vehicles. And the third category is that of shared mobility providers. Now, they are the players who actually commercialize the mobility service to the end consumers. Increasingly, what we're seeing is that there are increasing overlaps of players across the categories, and an operator sometimes is present in more than one segment. Now, on the basis of the structure, we're also seeing two broad operating models emerge. The first is where the technology player develops and integrates its own driverless software and hardware into the non-autonomous vehicle, and then they partner with a mobility service provider or an OEM to actually commercialize the service. This is a strategy that's been adopted by a number of players like Aurora, Argo AI, WeRide, and Ocean. We're also seeing shared mobility operators fit in this segment. Operators like Lyft and Didi are building autonomous platforms and commercial operations in collaboration with technology participants. The second model is where you have a manufacturer who carries out the entire value chain internally. So the company manufactures its own vehicle, integrates sensors, ADAS software and hardware, along with operating them as its own solution. So for instance, GM's Cruise, where they operate the own robotaxi fleet, as well as every part of the value chain preceding it, is a good example of this. In terms of the go-to-market strategy, you have the first B2C model, where solutions are offered to the direct public. So examples are Waymo's robotaxi service, Cruise's robotaxi service as well, and those offered by Lyft and Silks. The second is where these participants have collaborated or partnered with cities, and often their services are heavily subsidized by the governments. So some examples are Mobility, and they've got a service running in Columbus. And the third potential strategy is B2B, where the partnership is with either the mobility service provider or with potential corporates or institutional campuses. And we'll explore all of this in greater detail in the following slides. Now, the next slide gives a snapshot once again of the ecosystem, but in much greater detail. So the ecosystem as such is comprised of hardware technology players, software and application players, platform operators, and supporting services. And what's interesting is that the players who used to operate in silos no longer do so anymore. Rather, we see them expanding their product portfolio and increasingly collaborating with other stakeholders across the different segments. For example, Intel's subsidiary Mobileye and Sixt, which is one of the biggest players in leasing and mobility services. They recently announced a partnership where they intend to offer autonomous ride-hailing services in Munich by the end of 2022. And the autonomous driving system is going to be provided by Mobileye's Drive platform. Now, the expectation is that the fleet is going to be owned by Mobileye, while the supporting services like fleet maintenance and operations are going to be offered by Sixt. For its mapping system, Mobileye has actually partnered with a lot of OEMs as well in this value chain, like BMW, Nissan, and VW, to collect vehicle data that in turn powers the ADAS system. Another example of increasing collaboration is Hyundai. So they've developed taxis specifically for autonomous ride-hailing services. And these are going to be launched by Motion, which is actually a partnership between Hyundai and Aptiv. They're also going to be available for commercial services on Lyft's ride-hailing platform. What's clear is that the autonomous mobility ecosystem is likely to become very, very complex, but nuanced as well, with players collaborating and leveraging each other's specialization. Now, the next slide is where we look at the OEM strategy, in particular with respect to their activities in the robotaxi market. And it's been a very, very interesting space. We've seen a lot of developments from the OEM perspective side here, and it's very interesting to understand what the implications are to the overall mobility landscape. Till about 5 years ago, we saw that autonomous vehicles and mobility programs were led by companies like Waymo, Uber, and Tesla. However, there's been an increasing interest from OEMs in this space, and today we see that almost all of the major OEMs had either formed partnerships with leading autonomous tech players or outright acquired them and brought them in-house. Now, this trend started as early as 2017 when Ford invested about $1 billion or so in Argo.ai. VW later invested about $2.6 billion in the same company. Motional was set up in partnership between Hyundai and Aptiv. And very recently, in June of this year, GM announced investments up to about $35 billion in 2025 in their EV and EG technology strategy. This comes very shortly after GM's acquisition of the German radar company Astex in last year. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg. As vehicle autonomy moves towards level 4 and 5, and autonomous services are increasingly commercialized, we expect that OEMs will actively expand their footprint in this space. The next slide looks at another business model that's really, really taking off, which is the whole concept of autonomous deliveries and last mile logistics. This, in a large part, has also been spurred by the pandemic. While the pandemic negatively impacted a lot of industries, surprisingly, autonomous delivery services were benefited greatly from this. Now, deliveries today are currently limited by factors such as the cost of labor, worker availability, the ability to actually have them work in shifts. But by using autonomous vehicles, these costs can be cut dramatically. Increasingly, we're seeing that autonomous technology is being used for the delivery of goods from warehouses to delivery hubs and also for last mile deliveries. So we're seeing self-driving vehicles, drones, and robotaxis are playing a very, very important role in the last mile delivery ecosystem. They offer a number of options while also offering a high level of reliability. So not only would these self-driving vehicles and drones negate the need for delivery drivers, but it would also make delivery possible 24 hours a day, as well as help in addressing surge in online demand. We're seeing companies like Starship Technologies, Neuro, and QuickBot leverage autonomous bots to undertake deliveries. Now, some of these companies like Starship and QuickBot have actually been around from 2017 to 2018. And with the pandemic, we've seen an acceleration in the adoption of their business models, and they've actually managed in many cases to shift towards commercialization of these services. So Starship, for instance, has undertaken more than about 1.5 million deliveries since 2018. Neuro is another company that's moving in this space. So they're actually the first company to receive regulatory permission to commercialize their delivery services in 2020. Cruise as well is piloting autonomous deliveries with Walmart. Now, despite the fact that majority of the developments are actually taking place in the US, the EU is not lagging behind completely. we're seeing companies like Heliport and Teleretail who are also developing last-mile logistics solutions specific for Europe. In Russia, we've seen Yandex Rover. They successfully undertook commercial deliveries as pilots, and then they expanded in partnership with Grubhub in 2021 to offer food deliveries on college campuses. We're also seeing this trend of automation come into the long-haul and freight transport segment. Nuro recently partnered with FedEx to deploy next-gen autonomous delivery vehicles within certain FedEx operations. They're also undertaking parcel logistics services, and they've got a pilot program underway in Houston. Waymo and UPS have also partnered to undertake long-distance freight hauling. So what's clear is that stakeholders within the logistics segment are very, very clearly reevaluating their needs in the new normal. And they recognize that autonomous delivery technologies are improving security, flexibility, as well as durability, and are increasingly becoming a viable option. So this market is expected to take off quite rapidly. Now, this slide gives a snapshot of some of the key pilots and developments that we're actually seeing across the world. Now, we've segmented it at a regional level. We see that US as a region, or North America as a region, seems to be more prolific in the advancements towards automation. They're quite advanced in terms of the technology prowess, in terms of the regulatory framework and consumer adaptability as well, to a large extent. Waymo was actually the first company to launch robotaxi operations in Texas in December 2018. Lyft, another key player in the mobility market there, they've started offering autonomous ride-hailing services in partnership with Aptiv. Cruise as well launched its ride-hailing service, though it's open only to certain select members of the public, but still, it's commercial operations in San Francisco, and this was launched just a few months ago. In 2022, we're expecting Los Angeles to see its first autonomous taxi service led by Motion. So as you can see, North America seems to be a little more advanced in terms of the overall autonomous evolution. Now, Europe, we are seeing quite a few companies develop capability here, but what's held the market back is lack of regulatory framework and to some extent restrictive regulatory policies as well. However, the region is slowly catching up. So as we talked about earlier, Mobiline 6 are going to be launching their autonomous taxi trial in Munich in 2022. We've seen companies like Sensible Ford developing autonomous vehicles for Finland. The Chinese company NIO as well is going to be coming into the space and into the region. They're going to be launching a robotaxi service in Israel in 2022. Now, on the autonomous shuttle front, though, Europe has a bit of an edge. They've got a number of companies that are driving innovation. So you see players like Navia and Shuttle piloting autonomous shuttle services all across Europe, in many cases in partnership with cities. As a region, APAC as well is seeing a bit of traction. In particular, you see a lot of advancements in Singapore and Japan. Now, commercialization of autonomous mobility services, particularly autonomous shuttles, is going to be challenging without government support. And we'll explore that a little more in detail in the next slide. So the next few slides are output of some research that we've undertaken at Frost, where we analyzed about 100 smart cities globally from different perspectives. And one of the perspectives that we looked at was trying to understand what their propensity is going to be to adopt autonomous mobility and where they would rank in terms of an overall autonomous mobility ranking. Now, in this particular slide, we've mapped what the hidden cost of driving is. So we've compared the economic cost of congestion and road fatalities with the autonomous initiatives that we're seeing in cities. The size of the bubble actually denotes the passenger vehicle park in cities as well, which gives you an indication of the size of the potential market there. Now, what we're seeing is that cities right at the top of the slide are ones that are going to be particularly interesting as potential markets for autonomous vehicles. One of the cities, Los Angeles, actually leads in this regard. Now, as it stands today, it's already one of the key US cities for EVs. This can be in a large part due to the supportive regulatory framework. It's also due to the fact that California is a hotbed for innovation, with a lot of companies, tech companies in this space being based out of there. The city as well is quite forward-thinking in terms of adoption of autonomous vehicles. They already have a fairly advanced automated traffic surveillance system, which links all traffic lights in order to reduce congestion. And they're starting to plan for integrating autonomous vehicles into the system. California's Department of Motor Vehicles approved AV deployment permits for Cruise and Waymo in September of this year, and Motionel is going to be launching services very shortly there. Another interesting city is Paris. Now, this is actually headquarters to some of the leading autonomous tech companies like Navia and EasyBuy. In a large part, this is because France has very, very supportive framework for regulation. It was the first European country to establish a regulatory framework for autonomous vehicles. These vehicles are expected to be allowed on the road from September 2022. Now, the country's public transport operators as well, players like RATP, Transdev, and Keolis, have also been proactively integrating autonomous shuttles into their public transport ecosystem in partnership with companies like EasyBuy. So as you can see, it stands to reason why they are leading in this ranking. Now, in the next slide, we've compared two variables, the cost of the taxi fares as well as the minimum wage, to understand where we're likely to see robotaxis actually take off. So basically, we map cities to understand where the business would make greater sense for a robotaxi model. Now, markets on the right-hand side tend to be developed markets. Developed markets are typically characterized by high taxi fares. So on average, fares range between 10 and 15, going up to 20 per trip. They also have a fairly high level of minimum wages, implying that taxis have a higher operating cost associated with them. So it stands to reason that if these services can be shifted to automation, there would be a huge cost saving for the operators. The Scandinavian and Swiss cities have the highest taxi fares globally. And therefore, it comes as no surprise that some of the European autonomous initiatives have actually emerged from these regions. Sensible 4, for example, is based out of Finland and is piloting and plans to very shortly release commercial solutions there. Bestman is based out of Switzerland, and it's developing its fleet orchestration platform. Now, among other cities with high fares and high wages, US cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, and Seattle kind of lead in this regard. And we're already seeing San Francisco and Los Angeles in particular emerge as hotbeds for innovation. In Europe, you have cities like Paris, Vienna, Berlin, and some of the advanced APAC cities as well, like Tokyo and Sydney, all of which have also seen quite a bit of innovation, pilot testing of autonomous solutions. Now, the next slide that we're looking at is one where we looked at which cities are actually investing in autonomous infrastructure. So which cities or countries have set aside dedicated testing areas to pilot autonomous vehicles and are also evaluating the consumer acceptance of this technology. Now, when talking about these initiatives, again, US cities are leading in this regard. And we've actually seen a lot of traction at the state level. So you have states like Ohio, where about 540 acres of land have been set aside for EV testing. In Michigan, there's a dedicated 40-mile lane between Detroit and Ann Arbor, again, which is has been developed with extensive infrastructure to support autonomous testing. California, Arizona, and Georgia also have developed smart corridors and testbed for cars. UK is not lagging behind. They've also developed a 300-kilometer road stretch between Coventry and Birmingham for AV testing. They've set up their smart mobility living lab at Greenwich, which is an open environment, again, where these vehicles can be tested in real time along with normal mobility services. Germany as well has developed a digital test field in cities like Hamburg and Düsseldorf. In APAC, we're seeing a lot of advancement here. You've seen the entire western part of Singapore will be made into a testing ground for autonomous cars. China has got dedicated test zones with 6 applicable scenarios. So they're actually testing out different models, whether it's models for residential, industrial, commercial, campus, urban, and tourism. And Beijing, in fact, has more than about 140 kilometers of dedicated testing zones. Now, the country as such is really seeking to commercialize autonomous models by 2025. South Korea is another country that's not lagging behind. They've established a smart city called Key City, which is actually today the world's largest autonomous test bed. And a new test bed is being developed near the port city of Hwaseong. The next slide gives a snapshot of the open licensing policies that we're seeing across the globe. I won't spend too much time on this, but again, what's very clear is that most of the advancements that we're seeing in terms of the regulatory framework is indeed happening in the US, as we talked about earlier. Now, this slide is where we've ranked all the various data that we have about. So we've looked at initiatives, we've looked at the level of funding that's been set aside across the different cities, and we've looked at the regulatory framework that's being developed across these different cities in order to rank autonomous vehicles, or the propensity to adopt autonomous vehicles across the different 100 cities. Now, as you can see, there are a lot of cities in the developed world that are indeed leading. Paris, as we talked about earlier, is a very, very attractive market for automation. We've seen Navia and Easy Mile being based out of here. 5G connectivity is easily available, and city leads in terms of open data platforms. There are a number of other cities like Helsinki, Hamburg, and Sydney as well, where you're seeing heavy government support and a favorable regulatory outlook that's going to be driving the market. What we are going to be seeing is that in the US, there's greater proactiveness of private companies that's pushing the market. In Europe, in the APAC, we're seeing a bigger push coming from the public sector, from governments really, that's leading to the deployment of these solutions. Now that we've looked at the market, we've looked at what's happening at the city level, we've looked at the ecosystem, the question arises as to what this really means to corporate mobility. Now, the first and foremost impact is that private ownership versus shared ownership as vehicle ecosystem moves from a product-centric approach to a customer-centric approach is underway. And increasingly, we're going to see the entire market move towards a usership model, particularly when we think about an integrated digital ecosystem in the future. Vehicles are unlikely to be owned. And this implies that company cars are gradually going to be phased out as more autonomous vehicles are integrated into the ecosystem. As we talk about moving away from company cars towards corporate mobility and shared mobility modes, questions do arise as to what sort of impact would autonomous mobility have on this market. Corporate mobility models like car sharing have been estimated to reduce costs potentially about 30%. If autonomous comes into this ecosystem, the expectation is that there will be a significant cost reduction in cost and multiplication of the efficiency as well. Though there will be a high setup cost associated with operations, and so the adoption is expected to be gradual. Now, we've already seen quite a few B2B pilots underway today. Players like May Mobility have deployed autonomous shuttles for some commercial firms, like they partnered with a real estate firm, Bedrock in Detroit. We've seen Navia has also partnered with a company in Florida called Tavistock and another company called the Mali Innovation Center in Switzerland to transport the employees from point A to point B. And why these use cases are increasingly becoming popular is the benefits that they afford. Clean energy, the fact that they're easily deployable, they're optimally sized, and they could lead to less congestion and mitigate parking woes. The next element is the fact that we've seen this ecosystem evolve dramatically. We've already seen a few corporate mobility players come into this space, like Sixt is a fantastic example here. The expectation is that new business models are going to emerge as well, and they're going to be available to corporates in the short and long term. Now, while all developments point towards a very imminent move towards autonomous mobility for corporates, a potential inhibitor could be the lack of structured insurance products for autonomous vehicles. ambiguity about repair and maintenance services as well, because with an autonomous vehicle, you would see changes in the frequency and platforms through which they're offered. However, we are seeing collaborations that are advancing the market, like the Navia, Darwin, Aviva collaboration, the Navia AXA collaboration, the Easy Mile Alliance, which is likely to resolve issues on the insurance front. Increasingly, OEMs as well are addressing the predictive maintenance service issue. So players like Volvo and Daimler are expected to drive adoption of autonomous mobility services as they invest heavily in this regard. With all of this, the expectation is that autonomous mobility is going to evolve post-2030 in a fairly significant manner. One of the biggest markets for autonomous mobility is likely to be corporate mobility, though uptake is going to be gradual. And with that, I do come to the end of the presentation.